Shawna, welcome to Women Seeking Wholeness.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, Sheree.
I have to tell you, my sister Shawna, who passed away, spelled her name exactly like you. And so you don't see it spelled that way very often. And it's just nostalgic for me. I feel,
Yeah, it's a rare spelling, and it's funny when I do come across it. Like just this morning, there was a ABC video that was Shauna's ABCs spelled my way, and it takes you right out of
yeah,
it.
I know. Well, you don't see my name very often, especially it's usually not got an E at the end. It's, or I get called Sherry. And yeah, it just makes you feel a little bit like heard and seen to see your name. Well, I want to dive right into this because when you and I had our long conversation, gosh, I don't know how long ago that was, maybe a month or two, everything just is blending together for me right now. I don't know. But we went into a lot of depth with just this whole, finding your own code of health, really, I think is what we basically boiled it down to, because there are so many paths you can take and so many programs and so much advice. And a lot of it's very valuable and very relevant. But I think what I want to focus on today is just how you narrow in on your own really high vibration path with health. Because for those who listen to my podcast, they're not really interested in just kind of surviving or getting through the day or looking good. We're trying to establish our own code of divine health. So
Yeah.
let's kind of start with what you see are some major, I guess, precursors or foundational pieces to being able to really move into that for yourself.
Yeah.
How do you sculpt that with your clients?
I really love that because it's such a powerful shift. And it's like you said, I love that your listeners are open to that. A lot of women gatherings that I attend these days, that's kind of one of my grievances is that I come away and I was like, no one was open. No one was receptive to like doing more than surviving, and there's so much more possible in enjoying our bodies and enjoying our lives. And, just even recently, I was at another gathering where there's limitations, calories, sleep. Oh, I'm just getting older. These things that we attribute. And every time I'm like, oh, I just want to say, it's not about aging. It's not about calories. It's really about
Yeah.
this relationship you have with yourself. And,
So if
you know,
it's really, sorry to interject here, but it's like if it's restriction focused, that's not how we're engineered in our bodies. We're wired for abundance. So we're
exactly.
going to rebel against that. You can't sustain it.
Exactly. It's like we, at the very essence and core of every cell of our being, we desire freedom. It is the most basic human need. And there are so many powerful examples of the gift of freedom in history and what that enables for humanity to create, right? And so it's very fascinating to me. Like you said, if there's any kind of restriction, we're now operating out of a space of freedom, free of self. And we're going to rebel. Our body's going to fight against that. And we're going to see undesirable things manifest, like weight gain or stubborn weight or sleep and insomnia issues, these wrinkles.
Yeah, I do really believe, I mean, we are the creators of our lives. I know you and I are aligned on this. And so at the subconscious level, we're rebelling against that restriction focus and the lack thinking and the trying to mold ourselves into some ideal. The subconscious is trying to protect us from that. So it's holding on to the weight. Like you said, it's exacerbating the wrinkle effect, if you will, or the aging process because we're releasing stress hormones. And yeah, our body is actually trying to be like, danger, danger, danger. This is not really who you are.
Yeah, you're not safe to be in this space of releasing. And, when that's really what we're desiring to do. And I actually have a great example of this because this weekend we did a winter health retreat. And as we were going through the healing process, I actually started a miscarriage the first evening of
Mm.
I was managing this retreat and running it. but this is what I do. I work with women's bodies and I understand women's bodies. And so as I'm going through this miscarriage process, it's not a traumatic experience for me personally, because I actually already saw all the signs along the way. So now this is just a moment of acceptance for me, the completion of it. I had wondered and kind of felt like that was coming, and all the things lined into place, and it was that moment to release it. So I released it rather than asking and going through the emotional and mental turmoil of this typical process. Like, was there something I could have done differently? Is this my fault? But I already knew that this wasn't the time and space, and that I didn't even actually have an embryo forming. It was an anembryotic pregnancy. And this is just something that I intuitively understood and knew. And I also didn't need to rush off to the hospital because I knew and I trusted my body would release it. This is the third time it's happened to me. And I've just built that trust and that communication with my body. I knew nothing was wrong and that I would release it. And when I created my retreat schedule, actually, I had blocked off 4 hours in the afternoon on Saturday for personal time. And typically that's a little bit more than I give at the retreats because we like to be together discussing things. But it was winter, so I thought, oh, it'll be a good nap time for attendees and, just reflection and journaling. Those are great winter activities. Well, that happened to be right when my miscarriage passed. And so just all these things lining up, right? Trusting instead of worrying, how is this going to affect my retreat? I just knew. I was like, well, it's probably going to come during that time that that spirit, that intuition guided me to block out already, and to just trust that. And that's right when it came, and I knew how to manage everything with the contractions. And it's a peaceful process for me. But the pressure that I felt from the world was something I wasn't expecting. The intensity of other people's emotions around my loss.
Were you very vulnerable and open and transparent with your retreat group and letting them know it was happening right after it happened?
Yeah, as soon as it started to happen, I let the person I was working with know, oh, I'm having a miscarriage right now. And then as I went through that day, like that morning, we talked about it because I wanted to bring in this element of I've I've known that this was coming, and the timing is very purposeful. And to be able to just be with my body and nurturing ourselves the way that we were focused on that. And it was just very interesting to me too, how much bringing in other people's perspectives about this journey, it needs to be healing. You had mentioned, just feeling the weight of this feminine movement and, the PCOS and the things that we see in women's health right now, how they're really just the dialogue of us processing this shift into embracing the feminine in our culture and in our world. And that's so much of what I see. I didn't realize how much pressure there is around almost being expected to be traumatized, having it as an expectation that this would be traumatic when it's not for me, really opened up my eyes even more. I've already known, but it opened up my eyes even more to, I'm not a victim, I'm a vessel, and I choose everything that I choose. I listen and I talk to my body and I hear what it has to say. And so after 10 years of building this active relationship with myself and all the years, of course, living in my body, this is not a traumatic experience for me because we've been talking to each other. Whereas, the world is like, oh, aren't you just traumatized and full of grief and sorrow? And I understand that people do feel that, and that's very common. And I'm more than happy to sit with people and listen and be in that space with them and how they're feeling. But those are their feelings, not mine.
Yeah.
Very powerful to see that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that. I will say that for me personally, so I I had a knowing that there was another boy and girl joining our family. I saw them in vision, and I'd already had, biological children, and I knew that there were two more, a boy and a girl. I knew what they looked like. I named them, and I went through this really arduous journey of trying to bring them here through my body, and my body kept saying no. So unlike you, because this would have been, I had my last miscarriage at 42 years old. That's how long I tried to have them. And by that point, my doctor was just like, so this was 11 years ago. So I wish I would have known now what I knew then, and how I would have had a lot more patience and perspective with the process, especially spiritually. But I was so convinced they were coming. So it was traumatizing for me to keep having four miscarriages in a row, culminating in that last miscarriage. But I had a D&C each time. So even after my body miscarried, my doctor recommended that I go in and have, they scrape everything. And it's just it's a really violating process, honestly, that my body just wasn't trusted to do it on its own. I was just capitulating to the doctor, really. But I wanted to say I have a lot of compassion for women who feel a disorientation where they know a child is coming, or they
Yeah.
deeply desire to have a child, and they just keep losing, a
Yeah.
piece of that vision, and their body's tied to it. And then there are hormonal crashes, because when you have a miscarriage, this is something my doctor taught me, that when you have a miscarriage, your body goes into the same postpartum state that you would had you delivered the baby. So I
Yeah.
would always hit like some kind of a postpartum depression, and I would personalize it, and that compounded the grief. And so
Yes.
for so many women, I love what you're saying, and also recognizing that that hasn't hit mass consciousness yet, that we grieve and we hurt and it's painful and we want to yell, and these labor pains. I remember, so just as well, okay, two things. So I remember one of the last miscarriages I had, it was like labor. I mean, I was 12 weeks along, and that I delivered the embryo in the toilet. And that was so beautiful and so terrorizing. It was terrorizing, of course, because I was so sure this pregnancy was going to sustain, and I was pretty far along. But also, I felt the presence of what I now have in my home as 9-year-old Eli, thanking me, um, loving me, literally telling me, I'm coming, don't give up on me. And he came through he came through a private adoption a few years after that,
Yeah.
through my dear friend Jessica, his birth mother. And yeah, so I often reflect on, how our body. I love how you said we're not a victim, we're a vessel. We through the medical system, through all the health advice out there, through the scientific community, it's really taken our body wisdom out of this whole process. I mean, I wasn't about to go in and tell my doctor, no, I'm going to keep trying to bring him here. This is not my last pregnancy. Like, I knew, I had the knowing, I had this stewardship over my body. I had this spiritual experience, but I didn't feel safe, of course, telling my doctor about this. Of course, I didn't know when he said, I'm coming, I thought that meant I was supposed to keep trying to get pregnant. And I did. I had no
Right.
idea he was coming through adoption.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that I guide women through in my process, because those are the questions we need to ask. I know I have another child coming. And so if I didn't know that, so for me, my knowing is that I'm impatient. When I know they're coming, I want it to be right now. And I know it's not right now, but I still want it to be
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
Right. And so I have these placeholder pregnancies that satisfy my angst and my curiosity about my timeline. And they give me that space that just holds it and says, here's so you don't have to keep worrying about it every month and thinking about it. Right. And even though I already know, I know they're not coming yet. It wasn't the right timing, but I still know they're there. So it's easy to, like you said, like, okay, how do I do this? But we ask those questions, am I your vessel? And does it look the way it's looking in my mind? Here's how I'm visualizing it. Am I seeing it the right way? What pieces am I missing? And to open up our trust and our
Yeah.
intuition to really thinking about all possibilities, so that these people and these spirits can come through in the way that honors them the most. Because there's beauty in the healing power of adoption, not just in your line, but in their line.
Yes.
And just so as you personally experienced,
Mm.
but to ask those questions from the beginning, especially after that first miscarriage, and be like, okay, I've got to
That's
step.
it. Yeah. I was like, I'm out. And then he came in. He came in. He came through and he told me not to give up. And it was part of my journey and part of my learning to just, like you said, the trust aspect. I didn't trust my body back then. I was always in a fear response and kind of bracing myself for the next loss. So what you're talking about is a huge empowerment paradigm. But what I want to do is draw that metaphor into the miscarriages we have in our other creations,
In
because
everyday
it's very
life.
analogous to what you're talking about.
It is. It's so true. And this is really the core. You mentioned divine health, and this is really the core of it, because when we're moving in divine health, all things are possible and all ways are possible. And so we're really kind of trying to be that trickle of water into the stream of our best life, right? And so we want to flow more easily into that while creating the structure of the riverbed. And so with divine health, we're asking, we know what's innate. We know, I loved one of your podcast episodes. It talks about, we know what we've been called to. We wouldn't have that desire unless we were called into that space. And so we know what that is. And we know, we don't necessarily know the how, the why, the when, all of these more constructs along the way, but we know what we're creating. So whatever that creation is, allowing space for it to come into our lives in multiple different ways, rather than trying to just put a framework around that. And then the other balance of that, because you've got, all right, I know what's coming and I'm going to be flexible with how it comes into my life. But we do have power of visualization, and to say, I'm really going to create a space and sit with this creation, my business, my book, my parenting, whatever it is you're creating in your life. Sit with it for a moment and really ask it, what do you want to be? What do you, like, if you were to show me yourself as a creation, what does that look like? And that's how we are able to move more fluidly through into that journey, rather than the resistance that causes illness.
I love that. It does kind of boil down to the trust and surrender aspect. Those are two trigger words for a lot of people, because they don't, when you're in this like heightened and elevated emotional response, or in a fight or flight or anything, when something's up for you, it's really hard to conceptualize and contextualize what it is to surrender, what it is to trust it from an embodied standpoint. And I keep coming back to, and you and I talked about this before, that without our health, and health is also a loaded trigger word for people, but without having this inner radiance, we'll just call it, this energy, clarity of thought, it's all linked to what's happening to us physiologically. So it's really hard to be that clear vessel when we are really polluted with debris from our environment through food, and this isn't in a judgment, but I'm just saying, like, it doesn't make sense that we would be a clear vessel of the divine, or a clear vessel or a receiving instrument for our destiny and life path and spirituality if our physical vessel is experiencing that toxic buildup.
Exactly. We can't hold space for both, right? And there have been womb cleansing and things that I've been part of where, we actively affirm, my womb is not a space for fear and pain. And we turn that over and we allow it to be a space for creation and abundance and joy.
Mm. I had a womb blessing at Chalice Well in Glastonbury, England last summer. And it was done through a priestess. Well, she's very archetypal priestess. I'm not talking about literal like blessing from a religious standpoint, but it was we had been in a mystery school journeying together for the past almost a year, the group of us who were there. And it's very similar to what you're saying. We had already created the container of that second chakra, that sacral, where from really the womb space energetically. And it's a place where all creativity lives, including the birthing of children and ideas. But really, for me, it was coming back to claiming my purity. That's very
Yeah.
similar to what you're saying about there's no fear that lives there, et cetera. For me, it was coming back to my original divine child state, my purity and the essence that flows from there. And it was so beautiful because this is where I birthed, 4 children, but it was all and had 4 miscarriages. So 8 pregnancies. So 4 losses and 4 live children.
Mhm.
But it was also my divine child living there,
Yeah.
my, embryonic pure essence that I was reclaiming, which was
Yeah.
huge for me.
Yeah. And I've noticed that early in my connection with healing and understanding, where are we connecting to things? We connect to our inner being through the navel most. And so it's interesting. After that, I started to see all this research that was like, wait a minute, is it the brain affecting the gut or the gut affecting the brain? And I was like, it's just communication between the two. Your spirit is housed in your gut, in your womb space, in that navel, right? And
Mhm.
your
That's
connection.
literally our umbilical cord place.
Exactly.
To
Exactly.
mother, to
Yes,
mother.
you have it.
Yeah.
And to be nurtured through that space, and that we have connections to compassion, to endless love, and to the real feminine through the heart, and that we connect to that structure of divine and forgiveness and understanding through the third eye, that these are
Mhm.
powerful centers when you need to reconnect. Those are the 3 areas that are very
So
powerful.
have you found it helpful as you're working with people? I mean, I have my own way of kind of getting people in their bodies, especially when there's been a lot of trauma in those areas, whether it's through pregnancy loss like me. My first was a C-section. The rest of them were not. I had some scarring there. It was actually a child that long story, but I didn't end up raising her, was an adoption. There's a lot of drama, a drama and trauma, or there had been for me. And you know, every one of us as women, we carry a collective trauma through us literally being raped and pillaged on the collective level. And a
Mhm.
lot of it is housed there that we're all carrying it. So things like you said, like infertility, polycystic ovarian syndrome, even thyroiditis, hyperthyroidism, all of those endometriosis, literal bleeding disorders and disorders that have developed from, I believe, the collective that are now, really pronounced. I think it's because the consciousness is ramping up to what has been happening to us, but we're all tapped
Yeah.
into that as well as our own, there could be sexual abuse. There could be so many things that have happened to each one of us women. So how have you found to help women really come back into, I guess, sort of a noticing really of what's happening for them so that they don't feel like a victim to all of these things that have gone on?
Yeah, I love that question because it's been a journey of my own that I've gone through as we separate from what is our journey. Like for me, my journey isn't trauma in this most recent loss, but other people's is. And I feel the collective trauma of it as I go through it. But I know that that's not my trauma. That's not my grief. And so I can separate from that and process myself and then pray and feel and meditate for the collective,
Just
right?
as
And
an act of compassion, just it's
exactly.
still
Yeah.
very alive and real for this other, group. But I
Yeah.
love that you are not attaching to it. In the past, that's what I've done. For
Yes.
instance, like losing a sister to suicide, my sister Shawna, who spells her name like yours, I tapped into, and she left behind 5 children. So I tapped I tapped into a long time into the frequency of mothers who die, whether it's literal or figurative. And that was really heavy for me. So I was
Yeah.
coming at it like as a, crusade, like for mental illness, holding my sword in the air, and that energy served me for a time. It was very masculine, but it was also so heavy because there was a lot of intergenerational trauma that literally lived in my DNA,
Yeah.
ancestral, deep, deep ancestral stuff. So I love what you're saying about having the compassion, but not having to attach our umbilical cord, if you will, to
Yes.
that energy, to that trauma. Because we
Exactly.
don't have to, I believe that I had to feel what they're all feeling. And maybe I did for a time, right? Maybe I had to dip into that. I'm not going to judge myself for it, but I stayed there too long and it was
Mhm.
affecting my own energy.
Yeah. And our own health at that point, mental, emotional.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I had thyroid problems. I had a lot
Mhm.
of stuff going on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I see happen over and over again is yes, we need to process what you're going through, but we also need to understand when your is separate from the collective because there is a lot of pain in the collective right now.
It's getting ready to heal, thank goodness, but it's gonna
You
it's
can
gonna get
feel,
a lot more painful and more pronounced until we're really ready to birth, right?
yeah,
Lots of labor pains.
that's labor pains. What we're going through right now is what I call the transition. I'm a transition
Mhm,
guide. I help people
mhm. The
transition.
hardest part of labor right there.
This part, exactly. And this is the part where we need the most surrender. That's why it's so difficult.
Mm,
Transition is truly the surrender of allowing two divine beings within one physical space for one moment of time.
I love that. Say that again. Say that yumminess again.
Transition is the surrender, the allowing of two divine beings in one physical space for a moment of
Mm,
time. And we can inhabit it together, but it does need to be a surrender. You're here
mm,
with me, I'm here with you, and we're doing this together. And as we turn that over, it becomes filled with peace and joy and relief rather
mm,
than, this triggering the fear, the fight or flight. Like if we're not in this moment of surrender, we find ourselves saying, I'm going to die. Like I cannot do this anymore, right? And that could be any part of our creations. You're going to have this moment and it's going to feel the same. There's feelings of anxiety, fear, doubt, uncertainty, self questioning. But if you tap into it just beyond that, there's surrender, trust, acceptance, and allowance. And when you go into that space, rather
mhm.
than in those feelings of fear, you'll find that the way is already made. It's
Mm.
already happening. You're this close to it being what you see it being, and to just
Yeah.
really step forward into that.
You know, the whole thing about birth, like literally birth, the literal birth, is so complete. It's so rich with symbolism for what's happening to all of us in our hero's journey of life. Um, and as a mother, when you're saying these two divine beings are finally touching, it's that sacred space. Moving that over into the greater, of course, analogy of like we are always touching the divine. We're always in some kind of transition. Well, not always, I have to say, like there's usually a dark night of the soul that precedes it, but you're able as a mother to work through that transition when you have the vision of the baby.
Yeah.
You would never descend into the valley of the shadow of death without the promise, willingly, without the promise of this beautiful baby. And if you can't hold that in your mind's eye,
Yeah.
it's really, it exacerbates all of the feelings of pain and labor
Absolutely.
and suffering.
Yeah, and that brings us kind of full circle to what we talked about a little bit earlier of it is important to create your space for visualizing. What does this creation look like? Because
Mm,
it's what gets you through that moment of transition. And right now, as a world, our vision is a world full of peace. where everybody is united and doing what they're here on the earth to do and feeling fulfilled in that role. And so as we hold on to that vision, we know it's inevitable and we're transitioning into it. But we do need to hold space for whatever we're creating because it gets us through the valley of darkness.
Mm, so beautiful. And your website is called spiritualchildbirth.com, which is all the rich metaphors we've been using around this theme of birthing really a new you.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the term spiritual midwifery. I feel like I do that on some level with my programs and kind of what I run in my family and business is, let me help you through these transitions, whether you're going through a transition of divorce, whether you're going through a transition of losing your faith or a religious transition, whether you're going through any kind of a loss, really. Loss of identity is the biggest. That's what
Yeah.
I've been midwifing for the last 7 years unknowingly. But all of these things with the death and rebirth cycle ultimately bringing us to that divine baby,
Yeah.
that rich, beautiful creation that we have labored to bring into existence. So, wow. Well, is there anything else that you would say, kind of just as a practical tip as we wrap up? What we talked about visualizing. You talked about getting into, out of the victim story with seeing yourself as a vessel and just kind of into, I think you said surrender, trust, acceptance, allowance, which is a sacred process for everyone and how they get there. But if, let's say, somebody wants to go on the turbo track to
Yeah.
really coming into this new place, this new mindset or mentality of acceptance, trusting the body, going on to their own, like we talked about, your own code of divine health.
Yeah.
What's just maybe the, I don't want to say the quickest because we never want to rush it, but just getting right, like how do they seal in that mentality, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, there is one key that I have found unlocks this whole journey, right? And it's very feminine, and it's the creating space to observe. So this is the postpartum depression and these things, right? Every
Mhm.
month we have, whether we're still menstruating or not, every month we have a week of observation to notice what's going on around us and how we're interacting with it, and if anything needs to be shifted or nurtured in a different way. And so as we take this time to step back a little bit, even if it's just 2 or 3 days a month, and just plan and observe, it actually helps us navigate through the
Mhm.
waters of life more peacefully, because we can see what's coming up ahead and we can see what's not working very well. But very rarely I find in our society today, because it's just, I mean, you feel it already. You're like, when did we talk last? I don't know. Time's
I
just,
know, it's like, what's that, like 6 months ago or last week? I'm not quite sure.
yeah, time is moving so quickly. So we have to now actively take a surrender of our time to observe, whatever that needs to look like for you. Meditate and think about that. But that's the power that I've noticed in these journeys of trust and intuition. I created space to observe at the beginning of this pregnancy, and I could tell it didn't look or feel like my other ones.
Mhm. Mhm.
Everything that we're creating, we need to make a little bit of space every so often to check in and see
Check
how that
in.
functions.
Yeah. And as you were talking about that, it reminded me of kind of the phases of the moon, the
Yeah.
follicular phases and how they're, really timed with the dark moon and the new moon, dark/new moon, the shedding or the waning and waxing. And yeah, when we're tuned into those cycles, whether you're in menopause like I am, or whether you're, really gearing up for fertility to have children, it's the same. We're really, as women, especially, our cycles are very compatible, our sacred cycles really, with the phases of the moon and what's happening with the stars and cosmos, because that's what mother is.
Yes.
She is all of those things, the rising of the tides and all of those. I love that. Anyway,
Yeah.
okay, so people can find you on spiritualchildbirth.com. We'll have links to your Facebook group in the show notes. Thank you so much, Shawna, for being willing to come and go so deep, so fast with this.
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. I love what you're doing.
Thank you.